Let's do that. Cool. So excellent. Welcome, everyone. This is the first episode of Sounds Like Sustainability, which is a conversation about and for transformation and cultures of sustainability. This series of conversations that we're going to have is supported by the Centre of Communication and Social Change at the School of Communication Arts at UQ and the International Environmental Communication Association, the IECA. And I'm sharing in the chat. So that's not the links. I will share the links in a second to both the Centre and the IECA so that you can have an idea and check those to the Centre and the IECA and see what's happening there on their platforms. So this conversation, this sounds like sustainability ... should really be a conversation where we learn, where we laugh, and where we critically discuss if what sounds like sustainability actually is sustainability. And our expert today is Dr. Ray Maher from the Centre for Policy Futures at UQ. And I'm very, very grateful that you were like a minute after I sent out the request, you're like, yep, I can do that. I'm happy to have this conversation. So I'm very, very much looking forward to our chat today. As a postdoctoral research fellow at the Centre for Policy Futures, Ray leads research, consulting and capacity building projects with government and industry on sustainable development strategies. And what I think is really interesting, and we want to focus on that a bit today, is that he focuses on urban development and design, the Sustainable Development Goals and sustainable building design. And what I really like is that you address wicked problems using design thinking, using system thinking, and that your research is predominantly engagement focused and not only interdisciplinary but applied and really stakeholder focused. So that therefore it suits very beautifully to what the Centre for Communication and Social Change and the IECA stand for. So Ray, thanks so much for being here. And because the title sounds like sustainability already says so, I would love to just ask you, where are you at the moment? What can you hear? And is there any kind of particular sound that you would connect with sustainability in the situation where you are now?
Thanks, Francesca. Great to have a chat with everyone. Yeah, where I am now is sitting in a not particularly new building at the University of Queensland at the Centre for Policy Futures. It's a fully sealed building with no airflow. I can just hear the hum of air conditioning that's set a little bit too cold in a generally pretty warm climate. And I can just barely hear a trickle of rain outside. So I don't know if that really represents a vision of sustainability. It doesn't feel like it. But then I guess your pre-question, the way you had framed this to me before our chat, I was thinking of something quite different. And the way you framed it now, even that, there's just so many ways of thinking about these sorts of issues. But I might let you take it a direction where you want to go.
So my idea is that apparently we talk a lot about sustainability, and big organizations and corporates do talk a lot about sustainability, and even political institutions talk a lot about it. And then there are all of us, and sustainability is one of those wicked blurry terms sometimes, and people are usually either challenged or bored by talking about sustainability and being confronted with all the kind of products and services that are sold using this token or label of sustainability. And I think if we start to think about kind of little experiences in our life and typical sounds and the space that surrounds us, that leads us to a better understanding of sustainability. So I'm quite curious if this is a pathway where you can think of these tiny little experiences, maybe related to space or a certain location, or maybe related to a specific sound that remind you or that you would relate to sustainability, or maybe not, maybe something that is rather unsustainable. And you can hear the aircon and you sit in this room which is kind of very closed up from everything that we would associate with nature and green and life.
Okay, yeah, no, that's a really interesting approach to it. I guess there's two things that come to mind that kind of approach the two different parts of that. So one, just in terms of just a raw sound, I guess, and what I was imagining in prep for this chat was just a moment when I was visiting the home where I grew up in northern New South Wales. It's a pretty beautiful spot in the sort of the hinterland of Byron Bay. If you want to speak of it romantically, off in the hills, a bit in the bush, and one morning I remember waking up I got woken up early from the chorus of birds, and it was just like overwhelming. Now, this is a place I grew up. I lived there for almost 20 years, and I just returned home, for a visit after a few. But I'd forgotten just how dominant the sound of life is, of diverse biodiversity. So everywhere you go, there is just a constant chorus of insects. At nighttime, it just sounds like bells. Like it just sounds like a three-dimensional aura of bells of just different insects kind of pinging off in the night. And then in the morning chorus, I'm certainly not a professional bird observer or anything like that. But I just started trying to keep track of the different sounds that I could make out. And I had this very awkward way of kind of drawing a little diagram to help me think of them and to differentiate between them. And there was something like 20 different species of birds that a total amateur could identify amongst that morning chorus. And even though I grew up in that type of environment, which has changed in the time that I've lived and been away, it still surprised me it's so easy to forget. It's really easy to forget just what a living ecosystem on Earth is like to be a part of. And when I'm living when I'm at work in a sort of concrete jungle, but by most standard, it's an extremely green university. It's a big block by the river, and there's lots of greenery. Or even at my tiny suburban house where we've built a pretty lush garden and diverse native species and all the rest of it, it's still just it's another planet to a fairly intact or a rehabilitating ecosystem. So I guess in terms of the soundscape, I guess it's that, and the ideas that it draws upon are like, shifting baselines. What's normal? What's okay? If someone's growing up in an urban environment, what's normal look like to them? If someone's 20, if they think back to when they were a kid, how much change has happened? My wife always talks about when she was a kid, there'd be earthworms everywhere. Every time it rained, there'd be worms all out on paved surfaces, etc. And that's pretty rare now. And even things like that. So I guess, yeah, the intensity of life and shifting baselines are pretty important in there.
I do love the connection that you make with talking about the normal and how much sustainability and talking and thinking about sustainability includes this thinking about, okay, this is normal, and how can we expand on that, and what are those moments that get us to the situation where we start to reflect and say, oh, actually my perception of normal should be much larger, should include much more. And I think a lot about this kind of what is normal and what isn't normal. And I brought sound with me, a tiny little thing of sound, which is...
Oh, what have you got?
It is broken. It's the bell of my bike. And as you can see, it's a pretty cute kind of European bell for my bike. And usually it sounds really good. Oh, this is the sound. Here we go. And this kind of biking thing is something that struck me the most, and that brought me into the non-normal space when I came to Australia, because while biking was always something I did like every time with my kids in the trailer, and like in all those different situations, here biking is different. Biking is something you do in full-on lycra. Biking is something you do as a sport. Biking is something you really make a decision to. It's not a thing like that you use for transport. And so when I'm sitting on my beautiful bike with my beautiful big bell, and then I'm like in my dress, I get a lot of beeps and those utes passing me, and those trays go like, get off the road. And so what apparently is happening is, one, I'm labeled as a hippie just because I do something that was always normal. Secondly, what's happening is that apparently I create a disruption, I create irritation. And I would like to talk about two things, because one is, it is somehow related to your work in terms of urban planning and thinking about sustainability and space in cities, and how this can be created and designed and built. And the other thing is this idea of normality, and what is normal, and how much do we need this disruption and irritation, and why is this so necessary for us to think forward and to think about transformation processes?
Yeah, we certainly have a different road culture and riding culture in Australia. I ride to work most of the time, and it's, even on my short and very easy ride, it's still terrifying sometimes.
It
and
is.
it's not main roads.
I know.
Like we're not talking. It's so. Yeah, that's a shame. I think it's something that we've got to deal with. In terms of the disruption, it's really tricky. I'm parked firmly on both sides of that fence. Where, on one hand, I guess certainly the culture that I grew up amongst, I don't know part of or not, but amongst, was northern New South Wales kind of hippie culture, I guess, or quite a mixing pot of cultures, but certainly that was a strong part of it. And in terms of the environmental, a very, very strong environmental ethic, but the approach to that was purely through disruption, or that was certainly the dominant way that people engaged in sustainability. It was always, sticking it to the man. It was going to protests. I mean, the local national park, which I sort of grew up camping in and going to, has got a waterfall called Protesters Falls, and the only reason the forest exists at all is because in the 70s, a group of very committed and passionate people chained themselves to bulldozers, and it bloody worked. And now there's this, and I mean, if you look at the diversity of life there that otherwise wouldn't be because of that approach, it certainly can be effective. And again, recently there was fracking proposed and approved, etc., in a local area, and the force of resistance was so strong that they didn't just overturn it. It was a significant social movement had come together with support from the hippies and the farmers and lots of others, and then that's entirely been rejected now, and the company even effectively got a payout to withdraw their license, and it's no longer going to go ahead. So again, the disruption can work. At the same time, I think when the emphasis is disproportionately on disruption, it's really easy to put yourself from the outside looking in. So, I grew up in a small town and never imagined being part of policy discussions and driving the strategic plan for an organization or for a new development or something like that. I didn't see myself engaging in large-scale decisions of the type that happens primarily in big cities. And the only way that you can, an effective way of being a part of those discussions is to be part of the system which drives them. So that means, wearing a suit or whatever it is that you've got to do, going to, working in a university or some other big institution or industry or government, going to meetings, all those very formal structures that navigate the process through which you can then be an active member at a table and inform the outcome of something that happens through that way. Now, sometimes the people outside, like in the examples I gave, do end up having more influence than the average board member or whoever it is, because they can just completely overturn something, and that certainly works, but not always. And I think most of the big decisions keep rolling on, and if all of the people who, obviously this is not the case, but if all the people who had a serious environmental ethic and were concerned about sustainability disengage themselves from the system of decision making, then the outcomes are going to be worse. And that sort of, certainly there was a large part of my parents' generation that took that approach. And I think we're in a lot of ways worse off because of it.
If you think about sustainability, and if you use the term in this in what you say, and in how would you define it? Like, how would you describe it?
Yeah, I think there's two different approaches, and maybe they even align with those two different paradigms that I just mentioned of approaching it. I'm not sure, but there's two approaches that I use. One is the I suppose progressive version of sustainability, where shifting from the status quo or a current trajectory in something towards a more sustainable or less bad route is sustainability. You know, it's not a fixed point, it's a progress, it's a shift in what's normal. And there's a whole lot of good literature behind that, and there's a lot of good reasons why that should be the case. It means you can also celebrate a win, even if it's not utopia or anything like that. You know, every step in the right direction counts. And I firmly believe that, and that's very much the approach I take with my research. At the same time, if you're looking, just in one example, if you're looking at a fish species and you're seeing this stock declining because of fishing practices, and it's declining very, very rapidly, and you can, people are looking ahead and seeing what's likely to happen and looked at other precedents and all the rest of it. And if you change the angle from that to that, that's certainly a win, but you can't call that sustainable either. You're still locking in decline, and we know which direction decline goes. So things like, and I think that's where a much firmer version of sustainability comes in, where you can say in some ways if something is sustainable or not, and it is pretty black and white. And then I guess navigating those two, using the first, the steps of progression, etc., while keeping an eye on the second. So not being dogmatic about it, but knowing what really counts. And as long as, for example, and then that's back to the original, the really, not original, some of the really big picture and persistent sustainability issues like population growth, growth in consumption, resource management, etc., where remain critical. And whatever an organization does towards sustainability is excellent, and we should be encouraging and pushing those shifts all we can. At the same time, if it's still based on growth of consumption and population growth and all those other things, then you can see that that's still locking in decline. And I don't know if anyone's here on the call has got a wonderful silver bullet to navigating those two positions or where they stand, but I think they're both useful.
Excellent. I will ask for the silver bullet in a second. Just one more question, because a lot of people that I can see who are in the call today, they deal with communication and different forms of communication. So not necessarily just mediated forms of communication, but project-based communication, corporate communication, and then of course, like what communication actually does with people in terms of effects, in terms of awareness, acceptance, and all these issues. Do you think sustainability is used wisely at the moment in communication, or are there some challenges?
That's a good one.
What about the sound?
Is it used wisely? I think everyone uses communication for any. I'm not a communications expert, and I assume that there are many people in the call right now who are. But I think everyone uses communications for different purposes, and people have different agendas. I've certainly got agendas that I'm trying to push and contribute to. And if someone's agenda is selling another plastic trinket, and they can get some mileage out of the word sustainability, then unfortunately we can expect them to do that. And I think the current sort of the current policy and political norm around reduced regulation, for example, and even when pushing for sustainability, you've got to do it in a way which is very open for business and freedom, and not putting unnecessary shackles on human behavior and all the rest of it. Again, there's some perfectly legitimate basis to some of that, but it's also pretty clear that we can expect plenty of organizations to manipulate and take advantage, use communication strategically for their own ends, which are sometimes at the expense of everyone else. That's not taking a pessimistic view of human nature. There are countless examples of it. We can expect that. Therefore, to step into that process, that's what things like regulations are for. And if there needs to be regulations around use of communication, or if there needs to be ways of actually having people back up what they're saying with degrees of evidence, that's really helpful. I don't know. Again, that's no silver bullet, but I think you can see where I'm heading.
Awesome. Maybe I open up the discussion for potential silver bullets flying around in the audience.
Please.
If there are some ideas,
I'll take note.
Link to that. Same here. Are there any ideas or questions?
I can kick off. So I've basically been working mostly with that whole concept of sustainability, well, since the Brundtland report, and the issue of sustainable livelihood. So, working in rural development, particularly before I came to UQ, and that was all of us. What I hear a lot and what has been discussed so far is very much a focus on environment and how the environment in human life. For me, the whole debate about sustainability in rural development, particularly, which is another angle, is really about that balance between those different capitals, those different assets of the human, the social, the physical, environmental, and the financial capitals that have to be aligned to sustain certain, I think, goals that we have. And by definition, you're not going to sustain something that you have created. So by definition, the world constantly changes, and sustainability is the ability to sustain, I think, the achievement of those goals. But those goals will be shifting with the world changing, with new technologies coming out, with the population growth in place, with and I think particularly economic systems really influence. We cannot, as long as we still believe that a current economic growth kind of model is what we need to believe in, you're not going to be able to sustain positive goals for any of those other kind of aspects of capital. So that requires a bit of a transformation how people think, and you see that is happening with a circular economy kind of thinking, and with a whole lot of other. So I'm more inclined to really look at it from those different. It's also about social structures. It's about the financial kind of mechanisms, not just only the environment. And I'm more inclined to look at that holistic picture and the shifting goals that humanity has, and how we can, make sure that everyone can be in some sort of a balance. I don't know. It's not a silver bullet by far. It's very complex, and and then communication is how is really how you facilitate that engagement and that kind of providing information, but also dialogue and exchange and everything. So yeah. Not sure if that helps anything. It kind of complicates things.
I think it is what I really like is that I can see a link between what you just said and what Ray described as progression, and that it is really difficult to put a label on something that is in the flow, that is kind of growing, that is developing, and sustainability itself is therefore pretty often kind of put aside, and then sustainable development is coming in, describing the development, and that we're kind of really, the transformation process is nothing where we want to reach a certain goal, but it's really about the process itself. So that is this perspective, I think, makes a lot of sense. By the same time, my personal opinion in this area is based on my research that sustainability at least could work as a principle of action, as a guiding principle, or as a kind of normative framework that guides us in the direction. And if I'm having a really good day, I can even imagine that sustainability at some point makes us to what we would call a universal value, something like democracy, something like social justice, and then this makes more sense than the tokenism or the use and abuse and communication as it's happening at the moment.
It's a nice vision, Francesca, and I think we're well on the way. Certainly in a lot of areas, depends what lens you take in terms of where you set the boundary. But I think there's plenty of examples where that's very much underway or in fact well established.
Do you have an example? Sorry, you say that.
Well, so one example, there's a new project which we're just about to begin, which is pretty exciting. I won't go into the details, but it's a major international developer is developing a very, very large area of land for hundreds of thousands of people to live in. And fundamentally, they're a traditional property-focused developer with a lot of capital behind them and those sorts of priorities that we would expect in those areas. And yet they're still commissioning a sustainability framework above and beyond what's required for their environmental approvals, and so far everything's suggesting that they're going to take that very seriously and that's going to guide the direction of the development. Now I can see that in kind of niche cases where developers would do that for the environmental credentials and where that's going to help them get a higher return on investment and whatever else it is, as part of the economic rationalism. But everything so far is suggesting that this is above and beyond that, and hence we can hope that the outcome will be above and beyond that as well. So that's not an area where you'd expect to see that very often. That said, the outcome is still going to be very much in the progress area, and it's not going to be a benchmark for all of global society to copy as a model of what sustainable living looks like.
Love that. Curious. Makes me curious. Are there any other questions? Every other kind of silver bullets flying around? I do have one more question. Sky, did you want to ask something? Sorry, you go.
I wasn't really going to ask anything, but it's just a little reflection that I've got. Like, so I live in a kind of semi-rural area. We have our own septic. We have to collect our own water, and it's national park and all that kind of thing. And so there's elements of my life that are kind of sustainable. But the fact that there's no public transport means I drive everywhere. The fact that there's no shop up here means I have to drive, or you have to get someone to drive. I can't use solar power because there's too many trees that I'm not going to cut them down anyway, but I'm not allowed to cut them down. So I think I think the conversation, it's useful to have a conversation about sustainability, sure, but what that looks like in different contexts is really quite different. And for me to have a more sustainable life, I'm not sure how I do that. Like, I can't ride my bike. I live at the top of a mountain. There's no way I'm riding up that mountain on a bike. So I think sometimes there's things I can do as an individual, totally, but then I think there needs to be some top down, like there should be public transport. Why is it even possible for a new product to be developed in the world whose life cycle is not biodegradable? Like these kinds of things, there's like, back and forward. So I'd like to be more sustainable, but there's a limit really to how much I can do given infrastructure, I suppose. That was just a little thought I had, that's all. Nothing important, really.
No, I think that's incredibly important. I think that's going back to those sort of two different paradigms of the way different groups of people approach sustainability in relation to that as well. There's a lot of people I know who spend a huge amount of their time and effort ensuring their personal footprint of their lifestyle has the minimal environmental impact. And I know elsewhere we're talking here the environmental focus of sustainability very much, but certainly the social dynamic, the mechanism of achieving that via social means. But at the same time, I know other people who in a single day's work, a single meeting that they might have gone to, that just their contribution to that in terms of the direction that whatever outcome tilted by 5 degrees towards sustainability, would completely overwhelm their life's impact in terms of their personal footprint. I think people are very, certainly there are enormous pyramids of power and influence, and I think it's relevant taking that into consideration when we're trying to do anything at all of any kind. And secondly, I think because that apply, those of us who can work in this space and have some kind of professional job and engage in a conversation like this, probably fall somewhere into that category in some degree, and hence it's probably not. For me, I've decided that it's not the best use of my time to focus too much on my personal ecological footprint. For example, I've done core things. I'm mostly vegetarian and cycle and all the rest of it. But beyond that, there's many things in which I can have much greater influence. And if you, for example, if you devoted the rest of your life to establishing public transport in the area in which you're in, which might not even know if it's feasible whatsoever. It's probably not. It's probably not. There's lots of places where it isn't for a lot of reasons. But I would expect some of those other types of systemic change outcomes and the influence we can have on them to greatly overwhelm our personal lifestyle choices in shifting sustainability outcomes. And I think that's why it's worth doing this systematically via institutions, via these sorts of conversations.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's an awesome perspective. Are there any other thoughts? I could see Jen Ray on her bike. That was awesome. It was just a tiny little glimpse of Jen, like, oh, I could see her because we started talking about bike riding. Elske.
I just wanted to comment on, the course that we are letting, which is one of these, it's going to be one of these UQ VC flagship courses, or they call them UQ Edge, but so it's called Complexity, Action and Sustainable Future. So it's going to be a course for all students. We're just piloting it with a small group at the moment. And what we really emphasize in that, of course, students have to understand that, the crisis we are in and the complexity that is involved, but then also really building on their agency, on their capacity to deal with it. And we really emphasize that need for, what can you do in your personal life? What can you do as a professional, because they're all graduating very soon. And then what can you do eventually if you're interested into policymaking? So really, always understanding, that you can have different roles in achieving that, that's a sustainable world. And I think that's very important, and we need to emphasize that more in our teaching and in our engagement with our research partners as well.
Certainly, it would be wonderful if all of our teaching did have that agency building approach to it, and I think that's not always there. But I think that's brilliant to be including in there. I should also say that I think that those different approaches across those different almost portfolio of leverage that we might have over sustainability outcomes, including our personal things, I think that the lessons learned from one area are often translatable to another. So when you're trying to live in a sustainable way in terms of lifestyle, etc., it really tunes you into a whole lot of little micro decisions that you're making, like but both the bigger ones and the smaller ones as well. And I think the sensitivity, I guess, that you can gain from that is something that can then come up in something perhaps more systemic or more engaged in the levers of power of society type thing. And it would be, I don't know, it'd be one that I think that investigating the way that translation is made is probably an interesting one, and it would be wonderful to see, where decision makers with more influence than most of us, what do they do at home, and how has that informed their other decision making? I'm sure that there's a translation.
I really love this kind of idea of kind of every one of us has at least the kind of duty to think about where to think about those situations where we can then realize this translation into other areas, like where are those connection points between the different areas of where we can do better. But by the same time, I really like this idea of kind of being an agent of change, being having this ethical duty of thinking very carefully. Like, we don't have to be perfect, but we are capable to identify those areas where we are influential, where we do have an impact, like where we are embedded in different systems. And I think there are systems where we are embedded in where we are more influential, and then there are systems where apparently we discover suddenly that we are much more influential than we thought. And so to then go this pathway, and maybe it's not the infrastructure and the bus that goes up to your place, Sky.
Yep.
There are different areas where you have exactly an impact, and this is exactly what is makes what is part of sustainable development and transformation by the same time. And awesome. I want to be a bit kind of time-wise at this point. So if there's nothing major or really urgently coming up that you want to articulate, or someone else, then I would like to direct you just briefly to the chat again, where I posted a Facebook page, a Facebook group where you can share your sustainability experiences, or exactly those tiny little things, as Sky just did. I think this is exactly why it is important. It is important to talk about it, just to talk about it and to start this reflection process. And by the same time, there is a growing list of beautiful sustainability sounds on Spotify. So it's basically songs. It's basically pretty cool songs for now. So we're adding other songs to get a bit more of a holistic approach to that. But I'm looking forward to kind of just share with you more conversations on this issue. And I want to say a massive thank you to you, Ray. That was super awesome, very insightful. That's exactly kind of the depth of the conversation we want to have. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and being our guest today. So that was really beautiful.